Welcome to a journey through the most heartbreaking moments in Family Guy history. Before we dive into these emotional stories, if you enjoy deep dives into your favorite shows, please subscribe so you never miss an episode. Over the next 2 hours, we'll explore the tears behind the laughter, the genuine emotion hidden beneath the comedy, and the moments that prove this animated series could touch our hearts just as deeply as it makes us laugh. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin this melancholy exploration of Quahog's most unforgettable tragedies. Family Guy has been making audiences laugh for over 2 decades, but beneath all the cutaway gags and absurd humor lies something unexpected. Real emotion, real loss, real sadness. The show has never shied away from exploring the darker side of life, and sometimes those moments hit harder than any joke ever could. Tonight, we'll revisit these moments, letting them wash over us like a gentle wave of melancholy as we drift into sleep. Our story begins with Brian Griffin, the talking white Labrador, who became the heart and soul of the Griffin family. But Brian's story doesn't start in the comfortable home on Spooner Street. It starts on a puppy farm in Austin, Texas, where a young dog was separated from his mother far too early. Brian was just a puppy, still nursing, when he was taken away from his mother Biscuit and his littermates. He barely had time to remember the warmth of his mother's fur, the sound of her heartbeat, the safety of being surrounded by his brothers and sisters. This early separation would haunt Brian for his entire life. It became the root of his anxiety, his depression, his substance abuse problems. When you're taken from your mother before you're ready, something breaks inside you that never fully heals. Brian carried that wound with him every single day, hidden beneath his wit and intelligence and sophistication. He was a dog who could speak, who could reason, who understood philosophy and literature, but he couldn't escape the trauma of being abandoned as a puppy. Years would pass before Brian would learn the full truth about his mother. Years of wondering if she thought about him, if she missed him, if she ever tried to find him. These questions lingered in the back of his mind during quiet moments, surfacing in his therapy sessions, manifesting in his relationships and his addictions. The dog who seemed to have it all together was actually deeply broken, searching for something he lost before he even knew what losing meant. Brian's relationship with the Griffin family became his anchor. Peter found him as a stray and took him in, giving him a home and a purpose. But even in the warmth of the Griffin household, Brian couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. That hole in his heart, shaped like his mother's absence, never quite filled in, no matter how many martinis he drank or clever observations he made. The memories came to him in fragments. The smell of the farm, the sound of other dogs barking, the feeling of being warm and safe before the world became complicated. Everything changed during a trip to pick up Stewie from his grandparents' summer home in Palm Springs. What started as a simple pickup became an odyssey that would force Brian to confront his past in the most devastating way possible. After losing their plane tickets at the airport bar where Brian got drunk, trying to numb whatever pain was eating at him that day, Brian and Stewie found themselves stranded, forced to make their way home through whatever means they could find. They stayed at decrepit motels where the sheets were questionable and the neighbors were loud. They hot-wired cars, an act of desperation that Brian never thought he'd commit. They even tried to steal a crop dusting plane, convinced they could fly it home, only to crash immediately after takeoff when they failed to notice the cows grazing nearby. As they hitchhiked through the American Southwest, the sun beating down on them, their feet aching from miles of walking, fate led them past a highway sign pointing to Austin, Texas, 8 miles away, the puppy farm where Brian was born. For a moment, Brian froze. He could drive right past, pretend he never saw the sign, continue on the road back to Rhode Island, and never look back. But something pulled at him, a gravitational force he couldn't resist. A need he couldn't articulate, but felt in every fiber of his being. After all these years, he had to know. He had to see his mother again, to tell her he understood why she gave him away, to maybe find some closure for the wound that had been bleeding inside him his whole life. Stewie was less than thrilled about the detour. Instead of riding comfortably down the highway toward home and air conditioning and his comfortable bed, they now had to walk 8 miles in the hot Texas sun. The heat shimmered off the asphalt in waves. Sweat soaked through their fur and clothes. But Brian was determined. This was his chance. Maybe his only chance. After a lifetime of wondering, he would finally have answers. They made their way to the farm, that familiar place that existed more in Brian's fragmented memories than in any concrete reality. The sights and smells came flooding back as they approached. This was where it all began. This was where his life as a conscious being started, and where his first real loss occurred. Luke and Betty, the owners of the puppy mill, still lived there. The operation hadn't changed much in all the years since Brian left. They welcomed Brian back with the casual friendliness of people who dealt with dogs every day, though they barely remembered him among the countless dogs they'd bred and sold over the years. To them, Brian was just another product, one of hundreds of puppies that passed through those kennels. Brian had to remind them that he was the one who could talk, the one who was different, the one who could never forget this place, or what happened here. Even then, the recognition in their eyes was dim. He was a curiosity, sure, but not particularly memorable. Brian asked about his mother. The question hung in the air for a moment, heavy and loaded with years of longing. Luke's expression changed, became softer, sadder. He exchanged a glance with Betty, and in that look, Brian already knew, already felt his heart starting to crack. And then came the words that would shatter Brian's world completely. Biscuit had died. About a year ago. The news hit Brian like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs and making his legs weak. She was gone. The reunion he'd imagined in countless daydreams. The conversation he'd rehearsed in his head 1,000 times during sleepless nights. The chance to understand and forgive and be forgiven. All of it evaporated in an instant like morning dew under a harsh sun. He would never see her alive again. Never hear her voice, whatever it might have sounded like. Never feel that connection he'd been denied as a puppy. The door had closed forever, and he hadn't even known it was closing. But the horror didn't end there. Luke led Brian into the house, and there she was. Biscuit, his mother. The dog who gave birth to him, who nursed him in his earliest days. But not alive. Not even buried with dignity in the ground where her body could return to the earth. She'd been taxidermied, stuffed and preserved and posed, turned into an end table. Her body supported lamps and magazines and coffee cups. Someone's drink was leaving a ring on her back. The woman who gave Brian life, who loved him even as the puppy mill system forced her to give him away, had been reduced to a piece of furniture. A conversation piece. A memorial that somehow felt more like desecration. Brian stood there frozen, staring at what remained of his mother. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't process what he was seeing. The indignity of it was crushing, suffocating. This was how they honored her memory. This was how they showed their love for the dog who'd made them money for years, producing litter after litter of puppies to sell. They'd turned her into a table. Luke and Betty seemed to think this was touching, a way to keep her with them, always. They didn't understand how it looked to Brian, how it felt to see his mother reduced to this. Stewie tried to make light of the situation, the way he always did when emotions ran too high, and he didn't know how to handle them. He made jokes about the table, about the sturdiness of the legs, about all the mundane observations that would normally diffuse tension. But even he could sense this was different. This was a wound that couldn't be joked away. The pain in Brian's eyes was too raw, too real. So Stewie fell silent and just stood there with his friend, bearing witness to this tragedy. Brian knew what he had to do. He couldn't leave her like this. His mother deserved better than to spend eternity as furniture. She deserved dignity, peace, a proper resting place where she could finally be at rest. So Brian and Stewie waited until Luke and Betty weren't looking, and they stole the body. It was awkward and difficult, carrying the taxidermied form of Brian's mother out of that house, trying not to damage her further, trying to maintain some shred of respect for what remained. They carried Biscuit away from the people who'd reduced her to an object, away from the puppy mill where she'd spent her life in service to humans who saw her as a commodity. They found a quiet spot to bury her, a place with grass and trees, a place where sunlight filtered through the leaves and birds sang in the branches, a place that felt peaceful and right. They dug the grave with their hands, the dirt collecting under their nails, their muscles aching from the effort. It was hard physical labor, but it felt necessary, important. This was the last thing Brian could do for his mother, the last gesture of love he could offer. As they lowered her body into the earth, Brian asked Stewie to say something, to give a eulogy, to mark this moment with words that would acknowledge who Biscuit had been. Stewie, never great with genuine emotion, struggled through it. He talked about only knowing Biscuit as a table, about how sturdy she was, how all 4 legs were the same length. It was inappropriate and awkward, missing the mark entirely, but Brian thanked him anyway. He knew Stewie was trying. He knew his friend was doing his best to help with something neither of them had the words for. It was the thought that counted. They said their prayers, Latin phrases half remembered from movies and television, words that sounded solemn, even if they didn't fully understand them. And they buried her there, covering the grave with dirt, and then with stones to mark the spot. Brian's mother was finally at peace, resting in the earth instead of supporting someone's morning coffee. But Brian wasn't at peace. The closure he'd hoped for never came. Instead of answers, he was left with more questions, more pain, a grief that felt bottomless. He'd lost his mother twice now. Once as a puppy when he was taken away before he was ready, ripped from her side by humans who cared more about profit than about the bonds between mother and child. And again, as an adult, when he learned she'd died without him ever getting to say goodbye, without him ever getting to tell her that he understood, that he didn't blame her, that he'd had a good life despite everything. The weight of that double loss would stay with him forever, another burden added to the collection of traumas he carried. Years later, when Stewie performed a cover of Anne Murray's song, You Needed Me, during one of his musical obsessions, Brian found himself unexpectedly moved to tears. The lyrics about being needed, about someone being there during the dark times, about gratitude for love and support, brought back memories of his puppy days with sudden, overwhelming clarity. He remembered, or thought he remembered, those earliest moments with his mother and siblings, frolicking together in the warm hay of the kennel, feeling safe and warm and loved, playing with his brothers and sisters, wrestling and tumbling over each other, cuddling with his mother, feeling her heartbeat against his small body, drinking her milk, and feeling completely content. Before the world became complicated, before loss and addiction and loneliness, before he knew what it meant to be alone, just pure, simple happiness with his family. But those memories were bittersweet now, tainted by everything that came after. He'd found his mother only to lose her again in the most horrible way possible. He'd discovered her fate only to be devastated by it, and he carried that knowledge with him every day, a weight on his heart that never quite lifted. The image of her as a table haunted him in quiet moments. Brian had learned the hardest truth of all, a truth that many people never fully grasp until they've experienced profound loss. Sometimes you don't get closure. Sometimes the wounds stay open, seeping and aching for years, or decades, or forever. Sometimes all you can do is keep moving forward, carrying your grief like a stone in your pocket, feeling its weight with every step, learning to walk despite it. The relationship between Brian and Stewie deepened after that trip in ways that would have seemed impossible before. They'd been through something together, something that bonded them in ways that jokes and adventures and time travel shenanigans never could. Stewie had seen Brian at his most vulnerable, most broken, stripped of all the wit and sophistication he used to armor himself against the world. And Stewie had stayed. He'd helped bury Brian's mother in the Texas dirt. He'd tried, in his own inadequate way, to provide comfort when comfort seemed impossible. He'd walked 8 miles in the brutal heat and stolen a body and dug a grave, all because Brian needed him to. And Brian never forgot that. In his darkest moments, when the depression got too heavy and the world felt too cruel, he would remember that Stewie had been there. That someone cared enough to walk through fire for him. This bond would be tested again and again over the years. They would travel through time, face death, argue and fight and drive each other crazy. But underneath it all was this unshakable foundation built on that day in Texas when one friend helped another bury his mother and say goodbye to a past that could never be reclaimed. Because they'd seen each other's pain, really seen it without flinching or looking away. They'd helped each other through genuine tragedy. And that's something that can't be undone, can't be forgotten, can't be diminished by time or distance or conflict. It becomes part of who you are. It changes the fundamental equation of your relationship. Brian's story of loss and searching wasn't unique among the residents of Quahog. Everyone carried their own wounds, their own tragedies, their own secret griefs. But his was perhaps the most foundational, the most defining, because it happened before he could even understand what he was losing. The trauma was baked into his earliest memories, inseparable from his sense of self. And by the time he did understand, by the time he was old enough and aware enough to seek answers, it was already too late to do anything about it except grieve. He was left with nothing but memories that might not even be real, stories about a dog he barely knew, and a grave in Texas that no one else would ever visit. The night is still young, and there are more stories to tell. More moments of heartbreak and loss that define the world of Family Guy. More characters who faced unimaginable pain and somehow found a way to keep going. More reminders that beneath the comedy and the chaos, these characters are trying their best to survive in a world that isn't always kind to them. Let's move forward now to perhaps one of the most unexpected emotional moments in the entire series. A moment when the show stripped away everything that made it recognizable and left us with nothing but 2 characters, a confined space, and raw honesty. A bottle episode that would change how viewers saw these characters forever. An experiment in vulnerability that proved Family Guy could do genuine drama just as well as comedy. Brian and Stewie found themselves trapped in a bank vault one evening. It was the kind of situation that seemed like it would be played for laughs. And indeed, it started that way. The door closed automatically at the end of the business day, locking them inside for what they would soon realize was an entire weekend. What followed was 30 minutes of television, unlike anything Family Guy had done before, or has done since. No cutaway gags to break the tension. No musical numbers to lighten the mood. No other characters to dilute the focus. Just Brian and Stewie, alone together, forced to confront each other and themselves in ways they never had before. The episode started with typical discomfort and gross-out humor. Stewie had soiled his diaper when the vault door slammed shut, startling him. With no way to change it and no other options, he convinced Brian to clean it in the most disturbing way possible. Brian, faced with the reality of their situation and Stewie's genuine discomfort, eventually agreed. It was humiliating and disgusting for both of them, played partly for shock value, but also establishing how desperate their circumstances were. They were truly trapped, truly helpless, truly dependent on each other in ways they'd never been before. But as the hours stretched on and they realized they were truly stuck for days, the conversation turned deeper. They got drunk on scotch, Brian had stashed in his safety deposit box, the alcohol loosening their tongues and lowering their defenses. They talked about things they'd never discussed, admitting truths they usually kept hidden. The vulnerability crept in slowly at first, then all at once. And then Stewie, in his drunken curiosity, noticed the gun. It was in Brian's box, alongside the alcohol. A pistol, carefully maintained, loaded, and ready. Stewie questioned why Brian would have a gun, especially given his liberal political leanings and his frequent speeches about gun control. It seemed hypocritical, contradictory. Brian tried to deflect, to change the subject, to laugh it off. But Stewie pressed, genuinely confused and increasingly concerned. And finally, backed into a corner with nowhere to hide, Brian told him the truth. The words came out quietly, matter-of-factly, as if he were commenting on the weather. The gun was there in case he ever wanted to kill himself. The scotch was meant to be his last drink before he pulled the trigger. Brian kept them there as an insurance policy, a way out if life ever became too much to bear. The admission hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking. Stewie, usually so quick with a comeback, so ready with a joke or an insult, fell completely silent. His eyes went wide. For once in his life, he had no idea what to say. Brian continued, his voice steady, but his eyes distant, as if he were talking about someone else entirely. He explained that sometimes life felt like too much, that he struggled to find meaning or purpose in his existence, that despite his intelligence and wit and all his accomplishments, despite the family that loved him and the friends who valued him, he couldn't shake the feeling that his existence was fundamentally pointless, that he was just taking up space, using resources, going through the motions without any real reason to be here. The gun represented control in a life that often felt out of control. It was power over his own fate. Just knowing it was there. Knowing he had an option if things got truly unbearable somehow made the unbearable moments more bearable. It was a safety valve, a pressure release. The knowledge that he didn't have to keep going if he truly couldn't stand it anymore. That he could end it on his own terms, quietly, efficiently, with one final drink to steady his nerves and then silence. Forever. Stewie challenged him on it, his voice shaking slightly. Why a gun? Why not pills, which seemed less violent, or hanging, which at least left the option of being saved? The morbid practicality of the question was vintage Stewie, but underneath it was genuine concern, genuine fear. He was trying to understand something that terrified him. Brian explained it seemed quickest, most certain, least likely to fail. He'd thought about it extensively, researched methods during his darkest nights, planned it out in his head during moments when the weight of existence felt crushing. This wasn't a cry for help or an idle fantasy or a dramatic gesture. This was a real contingency plan that Brian had made, a fully developed exit strategy for when his suffering became unbearable. The revelation shook Stewie to his core. He'd always seen Brian as the stable one, the voice of reason, the adult who had his life together. Brian was the one who talked Stewie down from his violent impulses, who provided perspective when Stewie got too caught up in his schemes. To learn that Brian was struggling this deeply, that he'd contemplated ending everything, that he kept the means to do so readily available, forced Stewie to see his friend in an entirely new light. This wasn't just depression or sadness or the kind of melancholy that everyone experiences sometimes. This was a fundamental questioning of whether life was worth living at all. This was existential despair so deep that Brian had made peace with the idea of not existing, had planned for it, had prepared for it. Stewie's response was immediate and visceral. He told Brian that he was wrong, that Brian's assessment of his own life was completely mistaken, that Brian's life did have meaning and purpose, real meaning that mattered. That Stewie himself needed Brian, truly needed him in a way he rarely needed anyone. That Brian was the only person in the world who truly understood him, who saw past the evil baby persona to the complex, vulnerable being underneath. They'd been through so much together over the years. Time travel adventures that nearly got them killed. Near-death experiences that bonded them in ways nothing else could. Quiet moments of genuine friendship when the masks came off and they were just two souls trying to figure out this confusing existence. How could Brian think his life was meaningless when he meant so much to Stewie? When his presence made Stewie's life immeasurably better? Brian listened, tears welling in his eyes, as Stewie poured his heart out with an honesty that was almost painful to witness. It was the most honest conversation they'd ever had, unfiltered and raw. No jokes to hide behind. No adventures to distract them. No ironic detachment to protect them from the vulnerability. Just two friends, trapped in a vault, talking about life and death and meaning and purpose, and whether existence itself was worth the effort it required. Stewie told Brian that sometimes just being there for someone else is enough. That making someone else happy, being someone else's friend, giving them someone they can count on when the world gets too dark, that's purpose enough. That's reason enough to keep going. You don't need to change the world or achieve greatness or leave a lasting legacy. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply exist for the people who need you. And Brian, whether he realized it or not, was essential to Stewie's ability to function in this world. He was the anchor, the constant, the one relationship Stewie could always count on. The moment was raw and vulnerable in a way Family Guy had never been before and has rarely been since. These two characters, who usually hid their emotions behind layers of irony and humor and absurdist comedy, were forced to be completely honest with each other. No safety net. No escape hatch. Just truth. Uncomfortable and necessary. And what emerged was a portrait of depression and suicidal ideation that was surprisingly realistic and moving for an animated sitcom. Brian wasn't crying for help dramatically. He wasn't being manipulative or attention-seeking. He was simply exhausted by the weight of existence and had prepared a way to end it if it became too much. The gun was quiet insurance, not a threat. But Stewie's words reached him in ways Brian hadn't expected. The idea that his presence mattered to someone, that he served a purpose in someone else's life, seemed to give Brian something to hold on to. A reason to keep the gun in the box unopened. A reason to let the scotch sit untouched. A reason to face another day, even when facing another day felt impossible. It wasn't a cure for his depression. It wasn't going to make all his problems disappear or suddenly give his life the meaning he'd been searching for. But it was enough. In that moment, in that vault, it was enough. As the night wore on and exhaustion finally overtook them, Stewie fell asleep. Brian read to him from David Copperfield, a book he'd brought to pass the time, his voice soft and steady as he recited Dickens's prose. The image of Brian reading to Stewie, his voice carrying them both through the dark hours, was oddly peaceful after the intensity of their conversation. It was tender in a way the show rarely allowed itself to be. When morning finally came and the vault door opened with a mechanical click, Brian silently carried a sleeping Stewie out. Both of them changed by what had happened in that confined space. Neither would speak of it directly again, but it had shifted something fundamental between them. The episode ended with no music, no jokes, no resolution beyond the simple fact that they'd survived the night. Sometimes that's all you can ask for. Sometimes surviving is enough. Sometimes making it through the dark hours without pulling the trigger is its own kind of victory, its own kind of triumph. Brian still had his demons lurking in the shadows of his mind. He still struggled with the weight of existence, still questioned whether his life had value. But he had a friend who cared, who'd sat with him in his darkest moment and reminded him why life was worth living, even when it didn't feel like it. This moment of vulnerability and honesty between Brian and Stewie would become even more important, even more poignant, in light of what was to come years later. Because the bond they forged in that bank vault would be tested in the most horrific way imaginable. A test that would shake the entire Family Guy universe and leave fans reeling in genuine grief, questioning whether the show had gone too far, whether some lines shouldn't be crossed, even in the name of storytelling. But when she walked onto that stage and began to sing, the audience didn't respond the way she'd hoped. Instead of appreciating her artistry, instead of recognizing the skill and dedication it took to perform these complex pieces, they started calling out requests for her jingles. They wanted the Pearl they knew from the radio, the cheerful voice that sold them products and made them smile during commercial breaks. They interrupted her performance constantly, shouting for their favorite advertising songs. She tried to push through, tried to make them understand that she was more than that, but they wouldn't let her. Every time she attempted another operatic piece, they drowned her out with requests for jingles about soap and cereal and toothpaste. The humiliation was complete and devastating. Pearl had worked her entire career toward this moment, toward being recognized as a serious artist, and the audience had rejected her completely. They didn't want the real Pearl, the one with depth and artistry and something meaningful to say. They wanted the commercial product, the manufactured personality, the voice that sold things. After that night at Carnegie Hall in 1961, Pearl disappeared from public life completely. She was presumed dead by most people. In reality, she'd locked herself in her house and vowed never to come out again, never to subject herself to that kind of rejection again. Brian was stunned by this revelation. There was so much more to Pearl than the cranky old woman he'd been seeing. She'd had dreams, ambitions, talent that the world had failed to appreciate. She'd been someone once, someone important, someone with hopes for the future. And that rejection had broken something fundamental inside her, had turned her from a vibrant young woman into the bitter shut-in he'd been assigned to care for. He felt terrible about the things he'd said to her, about telling her to drop dead. She'd already been dead in all the ways that mattered, locked away from life for 30 years. Brian rushed back to Pearl's house that night, hoping to apologize, to let her know that he understood now, that he saw her differently. What he found when he arrived nearly stopped his heart. Pearl had a rope around her neck, standing on a chair, preparing to hang herself. She'd finally decided that even this half-life of isolation was too much to bear. Brian burst in just in time, knocking the chair away, catching her, bringing her down safely. They both collapsed to the floor, breathing hard. Pearl crying for the first time in decades. Brian told her that he'd seen the documentary, that he knew her story now. He told her that her voice was beautiful, that her performance of certain operatic pieces was the most stunning thing he'd ever heard. Pearl didn't believe him at first. How could she believe anyone after what had happened at Carnegie Hall? But Brian was sincere, and slowly, over the following days and weeks, Pearl began to trust him. She started to open up about her past, about her dreams, about all the years she'd lost to fear and shame. Brian spent more and more time with Pearl, no longer because he was required to for community service, but because he genuinely wanted to be there. They talked for hours about music and art and life. Pearl told him stories about her glory days, about recording sessions and fan letters, and the strange surreal experience of being famous for something so trivial. Brian told her about his own struggles with feeling like his life lacked meaning, about his failed novel and his drinking and his inability to find lasting love. They understood each other in a way neither had expected. Two lost souls who'd been rejected by the world in different ways, finding comfort in each other's company. As their friendship deepened, Brian became determined to help Pearl see that life still had something to offer her. He sang to her, performed an elaborate musical number about all the wonders of the world she was missing by staying locked away. He showed her through song and enthusiasm that there were still beautiful things out there, still experiences worth having, still moments of joy to be found. Pearl was moved by his passion, by his genuine care for her well-being. Maybe he was right. Maybe she'd wasted enough years hiding from the world that had hurt her. So Pearl agreed to do something she hadn't done in 30 years. She would step outside, just for a moment, just to feel the sun on her face and the wind in her hair, to remember what it was like to be part of the world instead of locked away from it. Brian held her hand as they approached the door. Pearl was terrified, her heart racing, her palms sweating. Every instinct told her to go back inside, to return to the safety of her prison. But she trusted Brian. He'd saved her life once already. Maybe he could save her in other ways too. The door opened. Sunlight streamed in, bright and warm and overwhelming after so long in dim rooms with drawn curtains. Pearl took a step forward, then another. She was outside, actually outside. The fear was enormous, threatening to swallow her whole. But there was something else too. Relief. Freedom. The world was still here, still beautiful despite everything. She took a breath of fresh air and smiled, really smiled, for the first time in decades. Brian smiled too, so proud of her courage, so happy to have helped her take this step. And then a truck came out of nowhere and hit her just like that. One moment she was experiencing the world again, reconnecting with life, taking her first steps toward healing. The next moment she was on the ground, her body broken, everything ruined. The cruelty of the timing was almost unbearable. After 30 years of isolation, after finally finding the courage to try again, after taking that first terrifying step outside, she had mere seconds before tragedy struck. They rushed her to the hospital, but the damage was too severe. Pearl was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Brian sat with her in the hospital room, holding her hand, crying, openly. This was his fault. He'd convinced her to go outside. He'd pushed her to take that risk. If he'd just left her alone, she'd still be alive, still safe in her house, even if she wasn't truly living. Pearl saw the guilt on his face and told him not to blame himself. What happened wasn't his fault. And more importantly, that moment outside, those few seconds of freedom and joy and connection with the world, had been the best moment of her life. After 30 years of darkness, she'd felt sunlight again. After 30 years of isolation, she'd felt alive again. That was worth everything, even if it only lasted for a heartbeat. Brian had brought something with him to the hospital, a virtual reality headset he'd purchased at a rock concert. He placed it on Pearl's head and put one on himself, and together they experienced a vision of what their life could have been if things had gone differently. They saw themselves getting married, growing old together, having children and grandchildren, experiencing a lifetime of love and companionship. It was beautiful and bittersweet, a glimpse of what might have been in a world where trucks didn't come out of nowhere and second chances actually lasted. Pearl watched this vision of a life unlived, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling. Even this imagined future was more than she'd had in 30 years. And then, peacefully, with Brian beside her, and the vision of their imagined life together still playing in her mind, Pearl died. Brian removed the headset and sat there in silence, looking at her still face. He'd known her for such a short time, but she'd meant something to him. She'd represented possibility, connection, the idea that two broken people could help each other heal. And now she was gone. Another person he'd failed to save. Another loss to add to his growing collection. The episode was noted by creator Seth MacFarlane as one of the few that contained real human emotion, and he was right. There was something profoundly sad about Pearl's story. A talented woman destroyed by a single moment of public humiliation, who locked herself away for decades, who finally found the courage to try again, only to be killed moments later. The universe didn't reward her bravery. Life didn't give her the happy ending she deserved. She got seconds of freedom before everything ended. And Brian, who'd tried so hard to help her, was left with nothing but guilt and grief and the memory of what might have been. Later, at the Drunken Clam, Brian and Peter drank to each other's experiences. Both had gone through something difficult recently. Both had lost something important. An attractive woman at the bar gave Brian a look, and a large bird outside gave Peter attention, but neither man was ready to move on. They agreed they needed time to process what they'd been through, time to grieve, time to heal before they could think about starting over. Sometimes all you can do is sit with your sadness and acknowledge that it exists, that it matters, that the people you've lost deserve to be mourned. But Pearl's tragedy wasn't the only heartbreaking story about courage in the face of overwhelming odds. There was another member of the Griffin family whose suffering was perhaps the most consistent and devastating of all. Someone who endured abuse daily, who was treated with contempt by the people who were supposed to love her, who became the scapegoat for everyone else's dysfunction. Her name was Meg Griffin, and her story is one of the saddest ongoing narratives in the entire series. Meg has been the punching bag of the Griffin family since early in the show's run, but it escalated over the years until she became less of a character and more of a target. Every episode seemed to find new ways to humiliate her, to make her the butt of jokes, to remind viewers that she was unloved and unwanted even by her own family. Peter led the charge in most cases, treating his daughter with open contempt, making it clear he found her existence disappointing. Lois wasn't much better, dismissing Meg's problems and joining in the mockery whenever it was convenient. Even Chris, her younger brother, felt entitled to belittle her, to act superior despite being just as much of a loser as Meg was. The abuse became so normalized that it was just accepted as part of the show's formula. Meg would try to contribute to a conversation and someone would tell her to shut up. Meg would have a problem and her family would laugh at her instead of helping. Meg would achieve something and they'd find a way to diminish it or ruin it. Over and over, in episode after episode, Meg was reminded that she didn't matter, that she was worthless, that her family would be happier if she simply didn't exist. The cruelty reached a breaking point during a hurricane that trapped the family in their house together. With the television out and nothing to distract them, the Griffins played games to pass the time. But inevitably, every game turned into an opportunity to mock Meg. Peter hummed along to movie themes. The family relaxed. And then Meg made the mistake of opening a can of soda. The sound irritated Peter, and he snapped at her with disproportionate anger. When Meg dared to respond, to defend herself even slightly, the entire family turned on her with the kind of coordinated cruelty that suggested this was their favorite pastime. Something broke inside Meg in that moment. Years of abuse, years of being told she was worthless, years of enduring cruelty from the people who were supposed to love and protect her, all came flooding out. She snapped. For the first time in her life, Meg fought back. She started with Chris, calling him out for his constant bullying, for the way he treated her like trash even though they were both victims of their parents' terrible parenting. She pointed out that he never stood up for her at school, that he joined in mocking her even though they should have been allies against. The cruelty of the world. She asked him why it was so hard to show her basic human decency, why her own brother felt the need to pile on every chance he got. Chris had no answer. He just stood there, stunned that Meg was actually standing up for herself, that the family punching bag had finally hit back. Lois tried to intervene, to shut Meg down by suggesting she was taking her problems out on everyone else. The irony of this accusation coming from Lois, who had been doing exactly that to Meg for years, was lost on no one except Lois herself. Meg turned her attention to her mother, and what came out was devastating. She brought up Lois's criminal history, her drug addiction, her various indiscretions and moral failings. She pointed out that Lois was the opposite of the perfect mother she pretended to be, that she was a hypocrite who had no right to judge anyone. She told Lois that when she turned 18, she was seriously considering never seeing her family again, cutting them out of her life completely and starting fresh somewhere else. The words hit Lois like physical blows, breaking through her defenses, forcing her to confront the reality of what she'd done to her daughter. Lois broke down crying, actually apologizing through her tears, acknowledging that Meg was right. But Meg wasn't done. She turned to Peter, the ringleader of her abuse, the father who'd made her life miserable for years. Peter didn't even understand at first that he was being criticized. He found Meg's anger funny, couldn't comprehend that his actions had consequences, that his daughter was actually hurting because of how he treated her. Meg had to spell it out for him. She pointed out his destructive tendencies, his terrible parenting, the way he'd traumatized both her and Chris. She told him that if anyone in the outside world could see how he treated her, he'd be in prison. He was that bad. He'd crossed that many lines. It still didn't fully register until Meg called him a waste of a man. Those words finally penetrated Peter's thick skull, finally made him realize he was being insulted. He turned to Lois for support, demanding she make Meg stop. But Lois, still crying from Meg's earlier words, refused. Where had Peter been when Meg was attacking her? He'd sat there and done nothing. She wasn't going to defend him now. Within moments, the entire family turned on each other. Without Meg to absorb all their dysfunction, they had nowhere to direct their cruelty except at each other. Peter and Lois screamed at each other about their various failings. Chris chimed in with his own complaints and revelations. The family, which had been able to function as long as they had Meg to blame for everything, completely fell apart when forced to confront their own issues. Peter, unable to handle the reality of his own inadequacy, ran upstairs crying like a child. Lois went after him. Chris fled to another room. The house descended into chaos. Meg sat with Brian, processing what had just happened. Brian congratulated her for finally standing up for herself, for speaking the truth after years of silence. He told her she'd been brave, that she'd done the right thing. But Meg didn't feel victorious. She felt terrible. She looked at what her words had done to her family, how they'd immediately turned on each other without her to blame, and she came to a devastating conclusion. Maybe the family needed her to be their lightning rod. Maybe they couldn't survive without someone to absorb all their dysfunction, all their anger, all their self-hatred. Maybe her role in this family was to suffer so they didn't have to. Brian tried to argue with her, to tell her that wasn't her responsibility, that she deserved better. But Meg had already made up her mind. She went upstairs to where Peter was hiding and apologized. She took back everything she'd said, told her family that she'd been wrong, that she was just taking her own problems out on them. She welcomed their abuse again, offered herself up as their punching bag, restored the family dynamic that kept everyone else feeling okay about themselves. The family immediately accepted her apology and went right back to treating her terribly, and everyone seemed satisfied with this arrangement except Meg herself. The episode was widely criticized for its ending, for the message it seemed to send, that victims of abuse should stay in abusive relationships for the good of their abusers, that standing up for yourself is wrong if it makes other people uncomfortable, that someone who suffers has an obligation to keep suffering so others don't have to face their own issues. It was a dark conclusion to Meg's story, one that felt more tragic than the show seemed to realize. Meg had been given a moment of empowerment, a chance to escape the cycle of abuse, and she'd chosen to walk right back into it, because she'd been convinced it was her duty. The sadness of Meg's situation extends beyond just this one episode. It's present in nearly every appearance she makes. There was the time she was almost killed when Peter demanded she get him beer from a flooded fridge, and she nearly drowned while her father watched without helping. There was the time she was beaten half to death by a school bully in front of a crowd while everyone cheered. There was the time she fell in love with an Amish boy, and Peter actually stood up for her for once, only for the relationship to end anyway. There was the time she was kidnapped by human traffickers while on a trip to Paris, and the family's rescue attempt resulted in her losing the chance to marry a prince and escape her miserable life. Every time Meg reaches for happiness, it's snatched away. Every time she has a moment of triumph, it's undercut or destroyed. Every time she tries to improve her situation, the universe and her family conspire to drag her back down. She's trapped in a cycle of abuse that she's convinced herself is noble, that serving as the family's emotional punching bag is somehow an act of love, and the show presents this as okay, as acceptable, as just the way things have to be for the Griffin family to function. The tragedy of Meg isn't just in the abuse itself, but in how completely she's internalized it. She believes she deserves it. She believes her role is to suffer. She's given up on the idea that her life could be different, that she could be treated with basic human decency by the people who are supposed to love her most. And that resignation, that acceptance of cruelty as her lot in life, might be the saddest part of her entire story. There are other sad moments in the Family Guy universe, other characters who faced loss and heartbreak. There's Quagmire discovering he has a daughter and giving her up for adoption because he knows he can't be the father she deserves, then watching from outside as her new family loves her in ways he never could. There's Cleveland, leaving Quahog and his old life behind, saying goodbye to friends who'd been his constants for years. There's Joe, grappling with his disability and the depression that comes with it, making jokes about wanting to die because life as a paraplegic feels unbearable sometimes. There's the death of Carrie Fisher, actress and princess and beloved figure, commemorated in the show through Peter's eulogy for his boss, Angela. Peter delivers a genuine tribute, speaking about loss and saying that heaven had gained a princess. And for once, the show drops all pretense of irony and just lets the grief be real. Even the joke that follows, about Peter being at the wrong funeral, doesn't diminish the sincerity of what came before it. There are moments when characters face the consequences of their actions in ways that actually hurt. When Brian has an existential crisis after accidentally killing a dog and realizing that most people, including his own family, don't value animal lives the way they value human ones. When Peter needs a kidney transplant and Brian volunteers both of his, knowing it means he'll die, because Peter gave him a home when he was astray. When Stewie desperately tries to prevent his favorite TV show personalities from disappointing him, only to travel to Europe and discover they're nothing like he imagined. The show has proven over and over that beneath the crude jokes and shock humor, there's a beating heart. Characters who can genuinely hurt and love and grieve. Relationships that matter even when they're dysfunctional. Losses that leave scars. The Griffins may be terrible people in many ways, but they're capable of genuine emotion, of real pain, of the kind of suffering that makes you want to reach through the screen and tell them it's going to be okay, even though you know it probably won't be. And so the tapestry of sadness continues, thread by thread, moment by moment, character by character. Each story in Family Guy's history adds another layer to the understanding that even in a show built on crude humor and outrageous situations, there exists genuine pathos, real suffering, authentic human emotion trying to break through the chaos. Consider Peter Griffin himself, the seeming architect of so much of the pain in his family's life. On the surface, he's the buffoon, the man-child, the father who creates problems faster than he solves them. But there's a reason Peter is the way he is, a backstory that explains, if not excuses, his behavior toward his family and particularly toward Meg. That reason has a name. Karen Griffin, Peter's sister, a woman his own children didn't even know existed until she showed up one Thanksgiving, uninvited but impossible to turn away. Karen was a professional wrestler who went by the stage name Heavy Flow, and she was everything Peter feared and more. She was larger than him, stronger than him, meaner than him. She'd spent their entire childhood tormenting Peter, bullying him relentlessly, making his formative years a living nightmare. Every memory Peter had of growing up seemed to involve Karen humiliating him in some way, establishing her dominance through physical and emotional abuse. She'd beaten him, embarrassed him in front of friends, stolen his moments of happiness, and created a pattern of behavior that would echo through Peter's entire adult life. When Karen arrived for Thanksgiving, Peter's friends and family were initially excited. A celebrity wrestler in their midst. How exciting. How impressive. But Peter knew better. He knew that beneath the bravado and the muscles was the same bully who'd made his childhood miserable. And sure enough, Karen immediately reverted to form. She farted in Peter's face as a greeting, making everyone laugh at his expense. She told embarrassing stories about him at dinner. She encroached on his traditions, making everything about her. During the family football game, she physically dominated him, using her wrestling moves to humiliate him in front of everyone he loved. The saddest part wasn't even Karen's behavior. It was watching Peter's face as it happened, seeing the adult man regress to a frightened child. All his bluster and confidence evaporated in his sister's presence. He was that scared little boy again, powerless to stop the abuse, unable to stand up for himself, trapped in a pattern established decades ago. And everyone around him laughed because they didn't understand. They didn't know that every joke Karen made, every physical domination, every casual cruelty was reopening wounds that had never properly healed. Meg was the one who recognized what was happening. She saw in Karen's treatment of Peter an exact mirror of Peter's treatment of her. The same casual cruelty, the same thoughtless domination, the same assumption that one person exists simply to absorb another person's aggression. Meg understood, perhaps better than anyone, what Peter was experiencing, because she experienced it every single day. And in that moment, watching her father being bullied by his sister, Meg made a choice. She decided to stand up for Peter, to be the person for him that he'd never been for her. The confrontation came to a head in a wrestling ring. Peter, desperate to escape the cycle of abuse, challenged his sister to a match, disguising himself as a female wrestler named Maxie Patty. It was absurd and ridiculous and very Peter Griffin. But underneath the comedy was something real. A man trying to face his abuser on terms he understood. The match went poorly for Peter. Karen immediately recognized him despite the disguise and began destroying him in the ring. She was going to break his arms, maybe kill him, and she didn't care. Years of resentment and cruelty came pouring out. That's when Meg intervened. She appeared in her own wrestling disguise and hit Karen with a chair. Not a prop chair, like wrestlers usually used, but a real one. The impact was devastating, knocking Karen unconscious and putting her into a coma. Meg removed her mask and told Peter that she would always stand up for her dad, no matter what. It was an extraordinary moment of loyalty from someone who had every reason to let Peter suffer the way she'd suffered. But Meg chose love over revenge. She chose to protect her father, even though he'd never protected her. The aftermath was complicated. Karen lay in a coma at the hospital, needing an organ transplant to survive. The doctors asked Peter if he wanted to be tested to see if he was a compatible donor. And Peter, without hesitation, said no. He refused to even check. He walked away and left his sister to her own devices. It was cold and cruel and completely understandable. Karen had spent a lifetime making Peter miserable. She'd created the template for his own abusive behavior. She'd damaged him in ways that could never be fully repaired. Why should he save her? Why should he give her anything after everything she'd taken from him? The episode left Karen's fate ambiguous. She might have died. She might have recovered. The show never addressed it again, leaving Peter's decision to hang in the air like an unanswered question. But what the episode did make clear was that Peter's cruelty toward Meg had roots, had a source, had an explanation. He'd learned to be a bully from his own bully. The cycle of abuse had continued from one generation to the next, with Meg as the unfortunate recipient of Peter's unprocessed trauma. This didn't excuse Peter's behavior. Understanding why someone hurts others doesn't make the hurt any less real or damaging. But it added context, added depth, added a layer of tragedy to what had previously been played purely for laughs. Peter Griffin wasn't just a bad father because he was stupid or thoughtless. He was a bad father because he'd been broken long ago, and never learned how to be anything else. And Meg, despite everything, had chosen to save him anyway. She'd shown him more grace than he'd ever shown her. That's the real tragedy of their relationship. Meg keeps giving love to someone who doesn't know how to give it back. The cycle of abuse and trauma doesn't end with Peter and Meg. It extends to other corners of Quahog, touching other families in ways both obvious and subtle. Take Quagmire and his sister Brenda, whose story is perhaps the most disturbingly realistic portrayal of domestic violence Family Guy ever attempted. Where most of the show's sadness comes wrapped in irony or absurdism, Brenda's story was played almost completely straight, and the result was deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved, viewers included. It started with Quagmire ending up in the hospital after an autoerotic asphyxiation accident, which sounds like typical Family Guy fare, something to laugh at or cringe at. But when his sister Brenda came to visit him, bringing along her boyfriend Jeff, the tone shifted dramatically. Jeff was loud, aggressive, obnoxious. He berated Brenda constantly, treated her with open contempt, made everyone in the room uncomfortable with his behavior. When Brenda and Jeff stayed at Quagmire's house while he recovered, Jeff's abuse became impossible to ignore. He kept the entire neighborhood awake with his shouting. He terrorized Brenda in ways both public and private, and Brenda made excuses for all of it. Lois tried to intervene, taking Brenda out for lunch to talk about the situation. When she asked Brenda to remove her sunglasses, the bruise over her eye told the whole story. Jeff was beating her, regularly, brutally, and Brenda was in complete denial about it. She made excuses that echoed the real words of real abuse victims. Jeff was sweet when they were alone. He only hit her because she provoked him. It only hurt when she could see. Every rationalization, every justification, every attempt to normalize the abuse rang true in the most horrible way possible. This wasn't satire. This wasn't exaggeration. This was an accurate portrayal of how abuse victims think, and it was devastating to witness. The men tried to reason with Brenda, staging an intervention where Quagmire poured his heart out. He told her that the sister he knew growing up no longer existed, that this shell of a person living in fear wasn't who she was supposed to be. He wanted her back. He wanted to save her. But Brenda wasn't ready to be saved. She revealed that she and Jeff were engaged. Worse, she was pregnant with his child. The horror of this announcement hung in the air. Jeff was going to be a father. The man who beat his girlfriend in front of strangers was going to have a child to abuse. The cycle would continue. Joe, the police officer in the group, explained that his hands were tied. They couldn't arrest Jeff unless Brenda filed a complaint, and she refused to. The law couldn't protect someone who wouldn't protect themselves. It was a dark moment of truth about how the system fails abuse victims. Quagmire looked at his friends and made a decision. If the law couldn't stop Jeff, they would. They would kill him. The plan was simple. Invite Jeff on a hunting trip and make his death look like an accident. It should have been easy, but Jeff, despite his apparent stupidity, had anticipated this. He'd brought his own weapon and had his own plan. He knocked out Peter and Joe, intending to kill Quagmire deep in the woods where no one would find the body for weeks. But Quagmire, using his knowledge of autoerotic asphyxiation, managed to turn the tables. He crushed Jeff against a tree with a car, killing him violently. The three men stood over Jeff's body and made a pact never to speak of what they'd done. They returned home and presented Brenda with a forged letter claiming Jeff had left her. He was gone. She was safe now. But Brenda didn't react with relief or gratitude. She was heartbroken. She mourned Jeff, the man who'd beaten her, who'd humiliated her, who'd destroyed her sense of self-worth. She'd loved him despite everything, or perhaps because of everything, and his absence left a hole she didn't know how to fill. The episode was controversial for good reason. Critics pointed out that it portrayed domestic violence inaccurately in many ways. Real abusers don't usually beat their partners in public where witnesses can intervene. Real abuse victims don't always speak in obvious rationalizations that make their denial clear to everyone around them. And most importantly, murder isn't the solution to domestic violence. The episode seemed to suggest that men need to protect women from abusive men through violence, rather than supporting victims in leaving abusive situations safely and building lives without their abusers. But beyond the criticism, beyond the problematic messaging, there was genuine sadness in Brenda's story. She was trapped in a cycle she couldn't escape, even when escape was forced upon her. Her self-worth had been so thoroughly destroyed that she couldn't imagine life without the man who was destroying her. And the episode left her future ambiguous. She was pregnant with an abuser's child, mourning her abuser's death, unable to see that she'd been given a gift. Would she find another Jeff? Would she teach her child that abuse is love? Or would she eventually heal and build a better life? The show never told us. Brenda disappeared from the series after that episode, her fate unknown, her story unfinished. Years later, a brief appearance suggested she might have died, seen on a boat of deceased characters in a hallucination. If true, it meant Brenda never escaped her trauma, never found peace, never got the happy ending she deserved. Her story was just tragedy from beginning to end, a reminder that not everyone gets saved, not everyone heals, not everyone survives their circumstances. Sometimes the damage is too deep. Sometimes the patterns are too ingrained. Sometimes people are lost, and all you can do is mourn what they could have been if the world had been kinder to them. The theme of family trauma extends beyond just abuse and violence. Sometimes the saddest moments come from ordinary disappointments, from dreams unfulfilled, from the small ways that life grinds people down over decades. Joe Swanson represents this kind of quiet tragedy, the man whose life was defined by a single moment of catastrophe and who spent every day after struggling to find meaning in his survival. Joe was a police officer, athletic and capable, living his best life, when a criminal pushed him off a roof and paralyzed him from the waist down. In an instant, everything changed. His career as an action-oriented cop became complicated. His marriage to Bonnie strained under the weight of his disability and her exhaustion from being his caregiver. His sense of self crumbled. Who was Joe Swanson if he wasn't the strong, capable man he'd always been? The show often played Joe's disability for laughs, having him fall over or struggle with tasks or make dark jokes about wanting to die. And beneath those jokes was real pain. Joe's desire to die wasn't entirely comedic. He genuinely struggled with his quality of life, with the loss of independence, with feeling like a burden. When Peter rigged him to a harness and lifted him off the ground, Joe thought he was ascending to heaven and exclaimed joyfully that he'd finally died. It was played for laughs, but the underlying truth was heartbreaking. Joe would rather be dead than continue living as he was. This is the reality for many people with disabilities. Not because disability itself makes life not worth living, but because the world is often cruel to disabled people, making everyday tasks needlessly difficult, treating them as less than, pitying them, or ignoring them, or making them feel like their existence is a burden on others. Joe internalized all of this, and it poisoned his ability to find joy in his life. He had a wife and child who loved him, friends who valued him, a career he could still perform with accommodations. But he couldn't see past what he'd lost to appreciate what he still had. The tragedy of Joe is that he's stuck. He can't move forward, can't fully accept his new reality, can't find peace with who he is now versus who he was before. He exists in a perpetual state of grief for his former self, and that grief colors everything. His friends try to include him, try to treat him normally, try to remind him that he still matters. But Joe can't always receive that message. The pain is too loud. The loss is too great. And so he keeps making dark jokes about wanting to die. And everyone laughs because that's what you do with Joe's jokes. But underneath, everyone knows he means it at least a little bit. The show has occasionally given Joe moments of triumph, reminders that his life still has value. He's solved crimes, saved lives, been a hero despite his disability. But these moments are islands in a sea of struggle, brief respites from the ongoing challenge of existing in a body that doesn't work the way he needs it to. Joe's story is a reminder that some wounds never fully heal, some losses can't be reclaimed. Some people spend their entire lives mourning what used to be while trying desperately to find meaning in what is. Then there are the losses that come from death itself, not metaphorical death or emotional death, but the permanent absence of someone who mattered. The show has dealt with death many times, usually treating it with the same irreverence it treats everything else. But occasionally, death lands differently. Occasionally, the show pauses its usual rhythms to acknowledge that losing someone is genuinely sad, genuinely difficult, genuinely worthy of grief that isn't played for laughs. When actress Carrie Fisher died in real life, Family Guy took the unusual step of acknowledging it within the show. Fisher had voiced Peter's boss Angela at the Pawtucket Brewery, and when Angela died in the show's universe, Peter gave a eulogy that was clearly meant for both Angela and Fisher herself. He talked about losing a boss, but heaven gaining a princess, a direct reference to Fisher's iconic role as Princess Leia in Star Wars. For once, the show dropped all pretense of irony. This was just genuine tribute to someone they'd lost. Even the joke that followed, about Peter being at the wrong funeral, didn't diminish the sincerity of what came before. Death appears throughout the show in various forms. There's the death of recurring characters like Diane Simmons, the news anchor, Horace the bartender, Mayor Adam West, in honor of the actor's real death. There's the temporary death of Brian and his resurrection. There's the death of characters' hopes and dreams, their innocence, their belief that things can get better. Each death carries its own weight, its own particular sadness, its own reminder that time moves forward and nothing lasts forever, and everyone you love will eventually be gone. And then there's Rupert, the teddy bear, Stewie's constant companion, destroyed by Brian in a drunken fit of jealousy and given a funeral that somehow felt as real and sad as any human death on the show. The episode where Rupert was destroyed served as the show's 300th episode, a milestone that the creators chose to mark with genuine emotion rather than pure celebration. Stewie and Brian's journey to scatter Rupert's ashes became an exploration of mortality, friendship, and the fear of abandonment that drives so much of Stewie's behavior. During their trek up the mountain to find the perfect resting place for Rupert, Stewie and Brian fought. Brian admitted that he'd destroyed Rupert on purpose, that his jealousy had driven him to hurt Stewie in the most cruel way possible. The revelation led to a physical altercation that ended with Stewie falling and breaking his ankle. Brian had to carry him the rest of the way, and during that slow journey, they talked honestly about why Rupert mattered so much. Stewie explained that Rupert was supposed to last forever. He was supposed to be the one constant in Stewie's life. That would never leave, never die, never disappoint. Brian was a dog, and dogs don't live very long. In just a few years, Stewie would have to watch Brian die, probably from old age, definitely painfully. He'd already watched it happen once before in that erased timeline. He knew what was coming, and the knowledge that he was going to lose his best friend terrified him. Rupert was supposed to be his insurance against that loss, the friend who would still be there after Brian was gone. The conversation revealed the depth of Stewie's attachment to Rupert, and also the depth of his love for Brian. He wasn't clinging to a childish toy for no reason. He was trying to prepare himself for inevitable loss by maintaining something that could never be lost. And Brian, in his jealousy, had destroyed that sense of security. He'd made Stewie confront his fears earlier than necessary, forced him to face the impermanence of everything he loved. At the summit, they held a proper funeral. Brian gave a eulogy that acknowledged how much Rupert had meant to Stewie, how wrong Brian had been to take him away, how deeply he regretted his actions. They sang together, a slow, mournful song about saying goodbye. And then they released Rupert's ashes into the wind, watching them scatter across the mountain landscape. It was beautiful and sad, and surprisingly moving for a scene about a stuffed animal. On the drive home, while Stewie slept in the rental car, Brian stopped at a vintage toy store. He searched until he found an exact replica of Rupert, right down to the color and style. He bought it, and that night, while Stewie was sleeping, he snuck into his room and placed the new Rupert beside him. When Stewie woke and saw his old friend returned, he welcomed him back with tears of joy and genuine happiness. It wasn't the original Rupert. The bear who'd been with him through everything was gone forever. But this new Rupert could carry forward, could be the constant Stewie needed, could fill that hole in his life. The episode worked because it acknowledged something important. Attachment isn't always rational. Sometimes we love things or people or objects, not because of what they are objectively, but because of what they represent to us, because of the role they fill in our emotional landscape. Rupert was just a teddy bear, but he was also security and constancy and a shield against the terror of impermanence. Destroying him wasn't just destroying an object. It was destroying a piece of Stewie's ability to feel safe in a world where nothing lasts. And the fear that drove Stewie's attachment to Rupert, the fear of losing Brian, is one that resonates with anyone who's ever loved someone or something that won't last as long as they will. Pet owners know their animals will likely die before they do. Children know their parents are aging. People in relationships know that death will eventually separate them. We all carry this knowledge, this awareness that everything we love is temporary, and we all find different ways to cope with it. Stewie chose Rupert, and when that was taken from him, he had to learn to cope without that safety net, to accept that loss is inevitable, and that the only way through it is to love anyway, despite knowing how it will end. This is perhaps the ultimate sadness of Family Guy. Despite all the jokes, despite all the irreverence, despite all the crude humor and shocking moments, the show keeps returning to this fundamental truth. Life is hard. People hurt each other. Trauma echoes through generations. Loss is inevitable. And yet people keep going, keep trying, keep finding moments of connection and love and meaning in the spaces between the pain. The Griffins are a disaster of a family, but they're still a family. They keep showing up for each other, even when they hurt each other, even when they fail each other, even when they probably shouldn't. Brian keeps going despite his depression and his existential crisis and his brushes with death. Stewie keeps forming attachments despite knowing they'll end. Meg keeps hoping for better despite a lifetime of evidence that it won't come. Peter keeps trying to be a father despite not knowing how. Lois keeps holding the family together despite having every reason to walk away. Chris and Joe and Quagmire and Cleveland and all the residents of Quahog keep existing in this strange little universe where terrible things happen, but life continues anyway. That's the real emotional core of Family Guy. Not that life is meaningless, or that nothing matters, or that cruelty is funny, but that even in a world filled with pain and loss and disappointment, people find ways to keep going. They find reasons to laugh. They find moments of genuine connection. They find meaning in the struggle itself. And maybe that's enough. Maybe just surviving, just showing up, just trying to be better even when you keep failing. Maybe that's the most anyone can do. Maybe that's heroic in its own way. The emotional landscape of Family Guy extends into territories that are unexpected, places where the show confronts mortality and sacrifice in ways that feel surprisingly genuine. There's an episode that perfectly encapsulates the depth of the bond between Brian and Peter, a story that forces both characters to confront what they mean to each other when faced with the ultimate stakes. It begins, as so many Family Guy stories do, with Peter making a terrible decision. Peter discovered Red Bull and became instantly addicted to the energy drink. He consumed it constantly, operating at manic speeds, unable to slow down or think clearly. When Lois finally intervened and poured out all his Red Bull, Peter decided to make his own. And because Peter's understanding of chemistry is non-existent and his logic is deeply flawed, he reasoned that since kerosene is fuel and Red Bull is fuel, kerosene must be Red Bull. Brian tried to warn him that drinking kerosene would destroy his body, possibly kill him. But Peter, in his infinite wisdom, responded that whatever kills him will make him stronger, and drank it anyway. The kerosene didn't make him stronger. It caused immediate and catastrophic kidney failure. Peter collapsed, was rushed to the hospital, and was told by Dr. Hartman that without a kidney transplant, he would die. They put him on dialysis while searching for a donor match, but weeks went by with no compatible kidney available. Peter's condition deteriorated. His skin turned yellow. He was dying slowly, painfully, and the family had to watch it happen. During this time, Peter proved exactly why he was so frustrating to love. Instead of following his dialysis schedule, he skipped an appointment to watch Charles in Charge, his favorite show. It was selfish and stupid and perfectly Peter. He passed out afterward, and the family's concern turned to desperation. Time was running out. They needed a donor, and they needed one soon, or Peter would be gone. That's when Brian stepped forward. He volunteered to be tested as a potential donor. It seemed like a long shot. He was a dog, after all. How could his kidney possibly be compatible with Peter's human body? But miraculously, impossibly, Brian was a match. The tests came back positive. He could save Peter's life. There was just one problem. A devastating, heartbreaking problem that changed everything. Dr. Hartman explained that because Brian's kidneys were smaller than human kidneys, they would need both of them. Not one. Both. Which meant that Brian would die. The transplant would save Peter, but kill Brian in the process. It was a zero-sum game. One life for another. Peter's survival required Brian's death, and there was no way around it. Brian didn't hesitate. He agreed immediately. He told the family that he was ready to do this, that he wanted to do this. Peter had found him as a stray years ago and brought him into this family. He'd given Brian a home, a purpose, a life worth living. Brian owed him everything. And more than that, Brian loved Peter. Loved him despite his flaws, his stupidity, his selfishness. Loved him as a brother, as a friend, as the person who'd shown him kindness when he needed it most. If giving his life could save Peter's, then that's what he would do. It wasn't even a question. The family processed this information in different ways. Lois tried to stay strong, to be the rock everyone needed. Chris and Meg were devastated, but tried to put on brave faces. Peter himself was conflicted in ways he couldn't fully articulate. He wanted to live, of course, but the knowledge that his survival meant Brian's death weighed on him heavily. This wasn't just losing a pet. This was losing his best friend, his constant companion, the voice of reason who'd been there through everything. But it was Stewie who took it the hardest. Stewie, who'd already watched Brian die once in that erased timeline. Stewie, who'd sat with Brian in a bank vault and convinced him not to commit suicide by telling him his life had meaning and purpose. Stewie, for whom Brian was the most important person in the world. The thought of losing Brian again, this time permanently, this time knowing it was coming and being unable to stop it, was more than Stewie could bear. Stewie tried to keep it together. He tried to be brave, to accept that this was happening, and there was nothing he could do about it. But when he looked at Brian, really looked at him, and thought about never seeing him again, never talking to him again, never going on another adventure, or having another conversation, or just existing in the same space, something broke inside him. The grief was overwhelming. suffocating, all-consuming. And so Stewie made a decision. If Brian was determined to go through with this, if he was going to sacrifice himself for Peter, then Stewie would stop him. By force, if necessary. While Brian was sleeping, Stewie kidnapped him. He brought him to a playground in the middle of the night and explained that they were staying there. They weren't going back. Brian wasn't going to donate his kidneys because Stewie wouldn't let him. Stewie had worked out an entire scenario in his mind. The playground equipment would serve as everything they needed. The jungle gym was the grocery store. The swing set was the mall. The seesaw was the post office. The sandbox was their summer home. They could build a life here, just the two of them, and Brian would stay alive. Peter would die. Yes, but Peter was going to die anyway in just a few years from his own stupidity and lifestyle. Brian had decades left. Why should Brian sacrifice all that time for someone who would probably waste it? Brian listened to Stewie's plan. Listened to him describe this imaginary life they'd lived together at the playground, and realized how desperate Stewie was, how frightened, how unwilling to let go. And Brian explained gently, patiently, that this wasn't sustainable. They couldn't live at a playground. And more importantly, Stewie could live without a dog, but he couldn't live without a father. Peter, for all his faults, was still Stewie's dad, still the man who fed him and housed him, and in his own limited way, cared about him. Losing Peter would damage Stewie in ways that losing Brian wouldn't. Stewie started to crack. His voice got higher, more desperate. He said he didn't want to lose anybody. He'd lost too many people already, or almost lost them, or watched them hurt. He couldn't take another loss. He couldn't handle Brian being gone. The fear and grief poured out of him in an ugly, uncontrollable wave. He started crying, really crying. Not the performative tears he sometimes used for manipulation, but genuine, devastating sobs. His face contorted. Snot ran from his nose. Tears covered his cheeks. His whole body shook with the force of his grief. Brian was horrified and moved in equal measure. He'd never seen Stewie like this. So completely undone. So vulnerable. Stewie kept saying he loved Brian over and over, like a mantra. Like the words themselves could keep Brian alive if he just said them enough times. He hugged Brian tight and wouldn't let go, his small body clinging desperately to his best friend. And Brian, despite his resolve, despite his certainty that this was the right thing to do, felt his own conviction waver. How could he leave Stewie like this? How could he abandon the person who needed him most? But ultimately, Brian knew he had to. He convinced Stewie to release him, to let him go back and go through with the transplant. It was the right thing to do. It was what needed to happen. Stewie, heartbroken and exhausted, finally agreed. They returned to the hospital together, Stewie silent and numb, Brian trying to project a confidence he didn't entirely feel. The family gathered outside the operating room as Brian and Peter prepared for surgery. This was it, the moment of truth. Brian was about to give his life for Peter's. The mood was somber, heavy with the weight of what was about to happen. Peter tried to say something to Brian, some acknowledgement of the sacrifice, some expression of gratitude or love, but the words wouldn't come. What do you say to someone who's dying so you can live? How do you thank them for something like that? And then, just before they wheeled Peter and Brian into surgery, Dr. Hartman appeared with unexpected news. He'd had himself tested, and he was a match, a perfect match. He could donate one of his own kidneys to Peter, and everyone would survive. Brian wouldn't have to die. Peter would still be saved. The crisis was averted. The relief was palpable, overwhelming. Brian's life was spared. Peter would recover. Dr. Hartman explained that he'd tested himself because he couldn't stand the thought of losing 2 patients, and using Brian's kidneys had always been a long shot anyway. There was no guarantee they would have worked in Peter's body. This way was better, safer, more certain to succeed. Everyone celebrated, hugging and crying and laughing with the kind of manic joy that comes after extreme fear has been lifted. But the episode didn't end there. It couldn't end there without acknowledging what had almost happened, what everyone had been prepared to accept. Brian had been willing to die for Peter, completely willing, without hesitation or regret. And that meant something. It changed the equation of their friendship, added a weight and depth that couldn't be ignored. Peter had always known Brian cared about him, but this was different. This was ultimate loyalty, ultimate love, the willingness to make the ultimate sacrifice. And Stewie had revealed the true depth of his attachment to Brian, his absolute inability to imagine a world without him. The kidnapping, the playground, the desperate tears, all of it spoke to how essential Brian was to Stewie's sense of safety and stability in the world. Brian wasn't just his best friend. Brian was his anchor, his constant, the one relationship that made everything else bearable. And Stewie had been forced to confront the reality that someday, even if not today, he would lose Brian. Dogs don't live as long as humans. The grief he'd felt anticipating Brian's death was just a preview of what was coming eventually, inevitably, unavoidably. This episode captured something fundamental about the Brian and Stewie dynamic. Their relationship was built on genuine love, the kind that transcends logic or convenience. They annoyed each other, argued with each other, sometimes hurt each other. But underneath all of that was an unshakable bond. They would do anything for each other. They would sacrifice anything for each other. And the knowledge that their time together was limited, that eventually one would have to watch the other die, added a bittersweetness to every moment they shared. The show has explored the concept of Stewie potentially losing Lois multiple times, though usually in the context of his long-stated goal of matricide. For years, one of Stewie's defining characteristics was his burning desire to kill his mother and take over the world. It was his catchphrase, his mission statement, the thing that made him unique among television babies. But the show never really committed to exploring what would actually happen if Stewie succeeded. Until the 100th episode, when they decided to finally pull the trigger, both literally and figuratively. The episode began innocently enough. It was Lois's birthday, and Brian gave her tickets for a luxury cruise. Lois assumed the tickets were for her and Peter, a romantic getaway. Brian was annoyed because he'd actually intended the second ticket for himself, but Lois and Peter ran with the assumption, and Stewie was left behind. This upset Stewie tremendously. He'd wanted to go on the cruise. He'd assumed he'd be included. Being left at home felt like a rejection, and Stewie didn't handle rejection well. In a fit of anger and spite, Stewie declared he was going to kill Lois. It wasn't the first time he'd said such things. He'd been threatening to kill Lois since the beginning of the series. But Brian, tired of hearing empty threats, called him out on it. Stewie talked a big game, but never actually followed through. He was all bark and no bite. Stewie, stung by Brian's skepticism and determined to prove him wrong, decided this time would be different. This time, he would actually do it. He would kill Lois and show Brian he was serious. Stewie stowed away on the cruise ship, armed with weapons and determination. He found Lois standing alone on the deck one evening, looking out at the ocean, contemplating her frustrations with Peter, who'd been embarrassing her throughout the trip. And Stewie confronted her. Lois was shocked to see him there, couldn't understand how he'd gotten on board. And then Stewie pulled out a machine gun. For a moment, Lois thought it was a toy, another one of Stewie's games. But then he opened fire. The violence was graphic, shocking in its brutality. Bullets riddled Lois's chest. Blood splattered. She fell overboard, her body plunging into the dark ocean and sinking into the abyss. Stewie watched her fall, watched her disappear beneath the waves, and felt triumphant. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. After years of threats and schemes and plans, He'd finally killed his mother. Back home, Lois was reported missing. The authorities searched, but found no body, no evidence of foul play. Everyone assumed she'd fallen overboard accidentally, a tragic accident during the cruise. Peter was devastated, but as time passed, he began to move on. A year went by. The family adjusted to life without Lois. Chris was told she was at a health spa and would be back eventually, a lie meant to protect him. Meg actually flourished in her mother's absence, no longer competing for attention or approval. But then Peter came under suspicion. When the police searched the trash, they found drawings depicting Lois being killed in various ways, along with a gun. They assumed Peter had made the drawings and committed the murder. He was arrested and put on trial. The evidence seemed damning. His own friends and children began to believe he'd done it. Peter maintained his innocence, but no one believed him except Brian, who suspected the truth but couldn't prove it. And then, in a courtroom twist that shocked everyone, Lois walked in alive. She'd survived the shooting. The bullets had hit her. She'd fallen into the ocean, but she'd been rescued by a merman who nursed her back to health. She'd suffered amnesia and spent the year wandering the country, eventually working at a fat camp, getting involved with a white supremacist she didn't know was a white supremacist, and finally having her memory restored when a bottle was thrown at her head. Now she was back, and she had something important to tell everyone. Stewie had tried to kill her. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Stewie? The baby? But how? Why? Lois explained everything, and as she spoke, Stewie realized his life was over. He'd tried to kill his mother, and now everyone knew. The police would come for him. He'd be locked up, his dreams of world domination shattered, unless he acted fast. Stewie escaped from the courtroom and made his way home, where he took the family hostage. When Cleveland walked in for a casual visit, Stewie shot and killed him without hesitation, just to show he meant business. The murder of Cleveland drove home how serious the situation had become. This wasn't a game anymore. Stewie had crossed a line, and there was no coming back from it. Stewie forced Brian to drive him to CIA headquarters in Washington, D.C. Using threats and his surprising competence with technology, Stewie hacked into the CIA's supercomputer and took control of the world's power grid. He threatened to plunge the entire planet into darkness unless his demands were met. And his primary demand was simple. He wanted to be president of the world. The government, helpless against Stewie's leverage, agreed. Stewie became the most powerful person on Earth, ruling from the White House, implementing absurd laws and decrees, living out his ultimate fantasy. He banned direct-to-video Disney sequels. He forced Hilary Swank to provide milk for the world using her breasts. He created enemies lists of people he wanted eliminated for petty reasons. He was a dictator in a diaper, and the world bent to his will. But Lois wasn't done fighting. She returned to Quahog and armed herself with weapons from Stewie's secret stash. She infiltrated the White House and confronted Stewie in the Oval Office. What followed was an extended fight sequence that played like an action movie, complete with choreographed combat, guns, explosions, and hand-to-hand fighting. Mother and son battled to the death, both determined to be the one who survived. The fight raged on until Lois finally gained the upper hand. She had Stewie at her mercy, could kill him and end this nightmare. But looking down at her baby, seeing him helpless and defeated, she couldn't do it. Maternal instinct won out. She couldn't kill her own child, no matter what he'd done. It was her fatal mistake. Stewie took advantage of her hesitation, turned the tables, and was about to shoot her when suddenly he was shot instead. The gunman was Peter. He'd somehow made it to the White House and taken the shot that saved Lois. Stewie fell, mortally wounded. In the burning Oval Office, Peter and Lois stood over their son's dying body and held each other in silent grief. They'd killed their own child. The horror of it was profound. Even though Stewie had done terrible things, Even though he'd tried to kill Lois and had succeeded in killing Cleveland, he was still their baby, and now he was dying in front of them. And then the words "simulation over" appeared on screen. The entire 2-episode arc had been a simulation. Stewie had been testing what would happen if he actually tried to kill Lois, running it through a computer program to see how events would play out. And the results had shown him that it wouldn't end well. He'd either be killed, imprisoned, or live with the knowledge that he'd destroyed his family. His dreams of matricide and world domination came with costs he wasn't prepared to pay. Brian walked in with postcards from Peter and Lois. The cruise was going well. Nothing bad had happened. It had all been in Stewie's head, a possible future he'd chosen not to pursue. Stewie emerged from the simulation device and told Brian that things hadn't worked out well in the simulation. Maybe he wasn't ready to kill Lois or take over the world after all. Maybe those goals, which had defined him for so long, weren't actually what he wanted when confronted with the reality of achieving them. The two-parter was controversial. Some fans felt cheated by the "it was all a simulation" reveal, like the show had pulled a bait and switch. Others appreciated the storytelling ambition, the willingness to explore dark territory and then provide an out that reset the status quo. But beyond the debate about storytelling technique, the episode said something important about Stewie's character development. He was maturing. The sociopathic baby genius who wanted to murder his mother was evolving into something more complex. Someone capable of recognizing that his stated goals might not actually be what he wanted. The simulation showed Stewie what he would lose if he succeeded. His family would be destroyed. People he cared about would die. He would become a monster, isolated and alone at the top of the world with no one who loved him, no one who cared, no real connections or meaning. The power and dominance he thought he wanted came at a price that included everything that actually mattered. And when faced with that reality, even in simulation form, Stewie chose differently. He chose family, even the flawed, dysfunctional, frustrating family he'd been born into. This marked a turning point for Stewie's character. After this, his threats to kill Lois became less frequent, less serious. The show moved away from sociopathic Stewie and toward the more vulnerable, emotionally complex Stewie, who'd been developing throughout the Brian and Stewie-centric episodes. The baby who wanted to kill his mother transformed into the baby who needed his mother, even if he couldn't always admit it. The simulation also showed the family's capacity for resilience and unity in the face of crisis. When they thought Lois was dead, they grieved genuinely. When Peter was accused of her murder, Brian stood by him. When Lois returned and Stewie became a threat, they worked together to stop him. And when they thought they'd killed Stewie, the grief was real and profound. Despite all their dysfunction, despite all the ways they hurt and fail each other, the Griffins were still a family, still connected by bonds that went deeper than logic or reason. The complexity of family relationships in Quahog extends beyond just the Griffins. There are stories of children discovering disappointing truths about their parents, of parents failing their children in fundamental ways, of siblings who should protect each other but don't. There's Brian discovering he has a teenage son named Dylan that he never knew about. A revelation that forces him to confront his responsibilities and failures as a father. There's the ongoing saga of Chris trying to find his place in a family that rarely acknowledges his existence except to mock him. Chris Griffin might be the most overlooked member of the family, the one whose pain gets lost in the shuffle because he's not as obviously abused as Meg or as precocious as Stewie. But Chris carries his own wounds, his own disappointments. He's not particularly bright, not particularly talented, not particularly anything except large and awkward and constantly confused by the world around him. Peter largely ignores him, except to bond over stupid activities. Lois tries to encourage him, but doesn't really see him. Meg is too caught up in her own suffering to help with his. and Stewie barely acknowledges his existence. Chris's story is one of quiet desperation, of a boy who knows he's not living up to any potential, but doesn't know how to change that. He's been told he's dumb so many times he's internalized it completely. He doesn't try in school because he's convinced trying won't make a difference. He doesn't pursue his artistic talents, which occasionally show through, because no one has ever encouraged him to. He drifts through life waiting for something to happen, some external force to give him direction or purpose, because he's never learned how to create those things for himself. The episode where President Obama visited the school highlighted Chris's fundamental lack of initiative and his willingness to take shortcuts. When assigned to write an essay about hope for the president's visit, Chris couldn't come up with anything on his own. So he went to Meg, asked her what hope meant, and then plagiarized her entire response. Meg, who knew more about hope than anyone because hope was all she had, gave an eloquent, heartfelt speech about maintaining optimism despite circumstances that warrant despair. And Chris stole it word for word and presented it as his own. When he won the essay contest based on Meg's words, she was furious, but also resigned. Of course Chris took credit for her work. Of course he got rewarded for stealing from her. That was how things always went in the Griffin household. The cruelty wasn't even intentional on Chris's part. He didn't think about how it would hurt Meg. He just saw an opportunity and took it, the same way he'd seen his parents take opportunities at Meg's expense his entire life. Eventually they agreed to present the essay together, sharing the credit. It was a compromise that satisfied no one, but hurt less than the alternatives. And it showed, in miniature, the dynamic that defined so much of the Griffin family's interactions. Someone would hurt someone else, not always maliciously, but carelessly, thoughtlessly, without considering the impact of their actions. Then, they'd half-heartedly try to make it right in a way that didn't really address the fundamental problem. And they'd move on, leaving the wound to fester underneath the surface, ready to be reopened the next time circumstances aligned poorly. These patterns repeat throughout the series, creating a tapestry of dysfunction that feels both absurd and painfully real. The Griffins hurt each other constantly, but they also keep showing up for each other. They fail in big ways and small ways, but they keep trying. It's a family held together by obligation and habit, and the occasional flash of genuine love that reminds everyone why they haven't walked away yet. The show has never shied away from showing the dark side of family life. The ways parents can damage their children without meaning to. The ways siblings can wound each other through both action and inaction. The ways spouses can stay together long past the point where they should have separated, held together by sunk costs and fear of change, rather than any actual happiness. The Griffins are not a good family by most conventional standards, but they're a family nonetheless, and the show treats that fact with a mixture of mockery and genuine sentiment. Lois has her own struggles that often get overlooked in favor of other family members' more obvious problems. She's a woman who had ambitions once, who was talented and capable, and had a life ahead of her. But she married Peter, and over the years, those ambitions got buried under the weight of managing a household with impossible children and an incompetent husband. She shoplifted in her youth, dealt with addiction, made choices she regrets, and now she's stuck in Quahog, in a house that never stays clean, with a family that takes her for granted. The episode where Meg finally confronted Lois during the hurricane showed the cracks in Lois's carefully maintained facade. When Meg listed all of Lois's failings, the crimes and indiscretions and hypocrisies, Lois broke down crying. Not because the accusations were unfair, but because they were accurate. Lois knew she wasn't the mother she wanted to be. She knew she'd failed her children in countless ways. She knew she'd settled for less than she deserved and dragged her kids down with her. And hearing it spoken aloud, having her failures enumerated by her own daughter, shattered something inside her. But Lois, like the rest of the family, keeps going. She gets up the next day and makes breakfast. She drives the kids to school. She manages the household budget and plans meals and deals with Peter's latest crisis. She does all of this not because she's happy, but because it's what she knows how to do. It's her role, her function, the identity she's built over decades of marriage and motherhood. And even though it's killing her slowly, even though she dreams sometimes of what life could have been, she stays. Because leaving would mean admitting that she wasted her life on something that wasn't worth it. And that admission might be more than she can bear. Peter, for all his faults, occasionally shows glimpses of the man Lois fell in love with years ago. The man who made her laugh, who was kind underneath the stupidity, who had a good heart even if his brain didn't always work right. Those moments are rare and getting rarer as the show has progressed, and Peter has become more cartoonishly terrible. But they still exist, buried under layers of bad behavior and worse decisions. And those moments are what Lois clings to when she's wondering why she's still there. The fundamental sadness of Family Guy isn't in any single tragic event or character. It's in the accumulation of small disappointments, minor cruelties, missed opportunities for growth or change. It's in watching characters who could be better, who have moments of clarity where they see how they could improve, and then choosing not to because change is hard and patterns are comfortable. It's in the cycle of abuse that perpetuates from generation to generation, with Peter treating his kids the way his father treated him, and his kids likely to continue the pattern with their own children someday. The show has been on long enough now that we've watched these characters fail each other thousands of times. We've seen them hurt and betray and disappoint each other in every conceivable way. And yet they're still there, still together, still trying in their half-hearted way to be a family. That persistence in the face of overwhelming dysfunction is either noble or pathetic, depending on your perspective. Maybe it's both. As we reach the end of this long meditation on sadness and Family Guy, it's worth reflecting on what makes these moments resonate with audiences despite the show's overall tone of crude humor and irreverence. Perhaps it's because the sadness feels earned in a way that pure sentiment never could. When a show built on cynicism and shock value takes a moment to be genuinely emotional, that moment hits harder because it's unexpected, because it breaks through all the usual defenses and speaks to something real. Brian's death and resurrection. Stewie saying goodbye to Rupert. Meg accepting her role as the family's punching bag. Peter's sister Karen explaining why he is the way he is. Quagmire's sister Brenda trapped in an abusive relationship. Pearl dying seconds after finally leaving her house. Brian discovering his mother taxidermied. Joe's daily struggle with a disability that society won't accommodate. All of these moments cut through the noise and reveal characters who are suffering, who are trapped, who are trying desperately to find meaning or happiness, or just a reason to keep going. These moments remind us that underneath the cartoon violence and offensive jokes and general meanness, Family Guy is still telling stories about people. Flawed people, terrible people sometimes, but people nonetheless. People who want to be loved, who want to matter, who want to believe their lives mean something. And people who keep failing at those goals, but somehow keep trying anyway. The Griffin family and all the residents of Quahog exist in a state of perpetual disappointment. They reach for happiness and find it briefly, fleetingly, before it slips away again. They hurt each other and themselves in recurring patterns. They make the same mistakes over and over. They learn lessons and then immediately forget them. They are, in other words, very human, despite being cartoon characters in a show that trades on absurdism and shock. Maybe that's why the sad moments land so effectively. Because we recognize ourselves in these broken cartoon people. We see our own family's dysfunctions reflected in the Griffins. We understand the weight of generational trauma, the difficulty of breaking destructive patterns, the way love and resentment can coexist in the same relationship. We know what it's like to keep showing up for people who hurt us because they're family, and you don't abandon family even when maybe you should. Family Guy asks uncomfortable questions through its sadness. Is Meg right to sacrifice her well-being for her family's stability? Should Brian have been willing to die for Peter? Did Quagmire do the right thing killing Jeff? Should Peter have helped his sister Karen? These aren't questions with easy answers, and the show wisely doesn't pretend they are. It presents the situations, explores the emotions, and lets viewers wrestle with the implications. The show's willingness to occasionally drop its ironic distance and engage with genuine emotion is what separates it from purely cynical comedy. Yes, Family Guy mocks everything. Yes, it often goes too far. Yes, it uses shock value as a crutch, but it also creates moments of real beauty, real sadness, real humanity that resonate long after the jokes are forgotten. Think about the image of Brian carrying a sleeping Stewie out of the bank vault after talking him out of suicide, or Stewie scattering Rupert's ashes on a mountaintop, or Meg standing in the rain watching her family function without her before choosing to walk back inside and resume her suffering, or Pearl's hand slipping out of Brian's as she died, or Peter crying because his sister made him feel small and helpless again. These images stick with us because they're genuinely moving, genuinely sad in ways that transcend the show's usual tone. The long history of Family Guy is filled with these moments. They don't define the show necessarily, but they deepen it, give it texture and weight it wouldn't otherwise have. They remind us that even in a show about a talking baby and a talking dog, and a man who fights a giant chicken, there's room for genuine human emotion. There's space to explore what it means to be family, even a terrible family. What it means to love people who don't deserve it. What it means to keep trying when everything seems hopeless. And perhaps most importantly, these sad moments remind us that survival itself can be heroic. That getting up every day despite depression or disability or abuse or disappointment takes courage. That choosing to love people who hurt you, to hope for better when better never comes, to keep existing in a world that's often cruel. These things matter. They may not fix anything. They may not lead to happiness or redemption or closure, but they're worth doing anyway, because the alternative is giving up, and giving up means the pain wins. The Griffins keep going. Brian keeps going despite his suicidal ideation and his alcoholism and his repeated failures. Stewie keeps forming attachments despite knowing they'll end. Meg keeps hoping, despite a lifetime of evidence that hope is futile. Chris keeps showing up even though no one notices. Lois keeps trying to hold it together even as it falls apart. Peter keeps being Peter, which is perhaps the most miraculous survival of all. And we, the viewers, keep watching. Keep caring about these characters despite their flaws. Keep finding moments of genuine emotion in the midst of chaos and crude humor. Keep recognizing ourselves and our own families in these cartoon griffins. Keep hoping, along with Meg, that maybe someday things will get better, even though they probably won't. That's the real heart of Family Guy's sadness. Not any individual tragic moment, but the ongoing struggle to find meaning and connection in a meaningless, disconnected world. The show doesn't offer solutions or redemption or healing. It offers recognition. Yes, life is hard. Yes, families are dysfunctional. Yes, people hurt each other. Yes, most of us are just barely holding it together. But here we all are, still going, still trying, still occasionally finding moments of love and laughter and genuine connection in between the pain. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Maybe survival itself, persistence itself, showing up itself despite everything that makes showing up difficult, maybe that's the victory. Not a triumphant victory with trumpets and celebration. Just the quiet, unremarkable victory of making it through another day, another week, another year. Of still being here when so many reasons argue for giving up. That's what Family Guy's saddest moments teach us, if we're paying attention. Life is hard, and people are flawed, and happy endings are rare. But we keep going anyway. Because what else is there to do? Because somewhere in the midst of all the dysfunction and disappointment, there are moments worth living for.